Welcome to Followership, Toxic Leaders and Followers. The first 2 weeks of our course has been focused on what followership means, how we can identify our followership style, and how the relationship between a follower and leaders function. This week, I'd like to take this a step further regarding relationships which become toxic. Before we jump all the way to the worst type of toxic leadership, we really need to stop and consider the idea that rarely do leaders gravitate to that extreme. There are other factors that we must consider before labeling a leader as toxic. So what is the difference between bad and toxic leadership? Well, let's first talk about what leadership actually is. The first question that comes to mind is leadership inherently a good thing? If you remember back in week 1, we did a little bit of a word association game, and I would imagine that most of us, given a neutral experience with leadership, would define leadership in terms of positive or neutral terms. So when we look at this question, without objective experiences clouding your judgment, leadership is necessary and usually positive to neutral. But not all leadership is positive to neutral. Given objective experiences, this next question becomes a bit more telling. Can leadership be bad? Well, of course it can. But there's another question here too. Can leadership be toxic? Again, the answer is yes. However, this requires a bit more understanding of what toxic leadership actually means. As I shared earlier in this presentation, rarely do leaders gravitate all the way to toxic leadership. But for those who do, this graph may help us understand where that takes place. Let's consider some of the traits that toxic leaders may build from. First, leadership may be incompetent. Being incompetent doesn't mean that the leader is toxic, but could simply mean that they are a bad leader without the proper skill set to be successful. The leader and at least some of the followers lack the will or skill to sustain effective action. With regard to at least one important leadership challenge, they do not create a positive change. A leader may also be very rigid in this case. A leader and at least some of the followers are stiff and unyielding. And although they may be competent, they are unable or unwilling to adapt to new ideas, new information, or changing times. An intemperate leader lacks self-control and is aided and abetted by followers who are unwilling or unable to effectively intervene. A callous leader, and at least some of the followers, are uncaring or unkind. Ignored or discounted are the needs, wants, and wishes of many of the members of the group or organization, especially subordinates. As we look at these 4 traits, it's hard to call this toxic. However, we can see that this type of leadership is highly ineffective. But let's continue. We now see that concept of corrupt leadership. Corrupt leaders, and at least some of the followers, lie, cheat, and steal. And to a degree that exceeds any acceptable norm, they put their own self-interest ahead of the organization. But there's more. Insular leaders are those who minimize or disregard the health and welfare of others, that is, those outside of the in-group or organization for which they are also directly responsible. And finally, on our simple chart, we see evil leadership. Evil leaders use pain as an instrument of power. The harm that is done to men, women, and children is severe rather than slight. The harm can be physical, psychological, or both. And as we look at our chart, we see that the first 4 traits are ineffective. However, the last 3 that we have identified are best described as being unethical at best. So if we can identify traits that can be attributed to ineffective leadership and others that can be attributed to unethical leadership, how can we determine where bad leaders end and toxic leadership begins? In this chart, we can somewhat determine a tipping point for bad leadership, but truthfully, that line can move based on the culture and the dynamics of any organization. Leadership within a church or even a Christian university can move to toxic leadership much earlier than a Fortune 500 company. And other traits can be added to give even further consideration. The point is that there is a difference, but that difference is a moving target for some. So let's take a step back again and look at why people follow bad leaders. For many, there is a need that is being met. Such needs may consist of safety, where followers support bad leaders so that they are not singled out and targeted. They also feel protected, such as a parent would protect their child, even if the child is wrong. Authority, where followers simply follow because that's what they were told to do. This has been programmed into our minds over and over again. An example of this would be teachers who demand rule following to bosses who micromanage. Security, where followers know and follow the leader's rules, regardless of their validity and ethical standards, so that their job is safe. Stability, where followers continue to follow in order to avoid change. Some followers simply follow because they don't want to be in charge, and others follow because of their belief that the leader knows more than they do. If we understand why followers follow bad leadership, what is toxic leadership, and why do followers embrace toxic leaders? Lipman Blumen stated, "Leaders who first charm, but then manipulate, mistreat, undermine, and ultimately leave their followers worse off than they found them. Leaders who, by virtue of their destructive behaviors and dysfunctional personal characteristics and qualities, generate serious and enduring poisonous effects on the individuals, families, organizations, even entire societies that they lead. The draw to follow toxic leaders can be attributed to fear and power. Look at the following examples how followers create toxic leaders, and look for the connection to fear and power. A follower creates toxic leaders by abdicating responsibility for their own fate. This is done because of fear and the acknowledgement of the leader's power. Followers exchange freedom for protection. Again, there's a fear here and the acknowledgement of the leader's power. Followers prefer charisma to competence. Here's power again, which followers willingly give simply due to charisma. Followers' neediness and the leader's ability or resources which are used to meet those needs lead to the acknowledgement of power. And followers long for immortality or their own power and security. As you can see in each point, it wouldn't be difficult to see how bad leaders can learn to use the power that they have been given and use fear that is given by their own followers for their own personal gain. There are no courageous conversations here, and there are no equal relationships that are built on shared values. While few leaders actually reach this level of toxic leadership, the good news is that many more long to be a good leader. And it should be our prayer to emulate the biblical example of leadership. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 2 through 4 states, "Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away."